so much for watching tonight. I'm Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I could not be more thrilled to be here tonight for this virtual book launch for my good friend Richard Cox's new book, House of the Rising Sun. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but I wanted to tell you guys a couple of things coming up. We're going to be doing these virtual events probably at least for the next several months. And so with that in mind, we've been trying to put together a pretty robust schedule of events. So if you go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, you'll see that we have everybody, we have a big true crime thing tomorrow night. We have John Waters coming. We have some really big stuff happening in the next few months. Fiction, nonfiction, all over the place, doing some food related things about what's happening in the restaurant world. We're going to be talking about race and culture and some really, timely and serious things too. But we're also going to be being silly from time to time and having a lot of fun. So I hope you guys will join us for these virtual events, usually on Monday nights and Thursday nights, but we have some different ones dropping in here and there. So check those out. What else do I need to tell you? We have our subscription services going still really well. We're still doing curbside. The store is open, but if you don't feel like you want to come in and shop, we still have those curbside options. We are still doing our solo shopping hours on Sundays. So if you want to come in and have the whole Magic City Books experience all to yourself, you can just go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and sign up for a solo shopping hour, and it doesn't cost anything. You can just come in and have the whole store to yourself. You can bring your immediate family with you and just have a great Sunday afternoon in the shop. So come see us. We're excited to see you guys. It's been a weird few months, but we couldn't have gotten through some of these tough times without all of your support. So thank you for that. I was looking at a picture today from, I think, 2005, and it was of Richard and myself doing a book launch for his book, The God Particle. And, I was thinking, it's just so weird how time can fly. Time's been such a weird thing during this pandemic, but, for 15 years to go by, it just is a weird moment. And I'm excited that we're still kind of doing these and having this relationship and still launching these new books all these years later. So it's been a fun journey to be part of, even peripherally from that point. So tonight we're going to be talking about House of the Rising Sun and lots of other things. This book has been in development for quite some time. I remember reading an early draft of it, probably, I don't know, when was this, Richard? When would I have read that first go around?
Probably 3 years ago.
Yeah. So, and the book has changed a lot. We'll talk some about that too, as all books do when they go through this process. But congratulations on the book and welcome to your virtual book launch. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Yeah. It's, like I said, it's been really exciting for me just as your friend, but also kind of to be from the book side, to be, part of all these different books over the years and help you kind of get the word out and also get a chance to read some of the early drafts of these books. I guess the place to begin would be, why don't you kind of lay out for the people, what House of the Rising Sun is and what you're attempting to do with this book.
Yeah, so it's a post-apocalyptic thriller, and the event that causes the crumbling of civilization is an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, which I think a lot of people by now are familiar with. What causes it in my novel is a supernova, which is a star that's exploded, and this one happens to be kind of close to Earth, so we can see it in the daytime. It shows up in the morning as a big bright star that people wouldn't expect to see at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the effect that it has is to wipe out modern technology, basically anything that runs on a computer chip or a transistor, so phones, cars, the entire power grid, the internet, basically all of the modern conveniences that we are familiar with or that we depend on stop working. And, the reason that I always wanted to write a post-apocalyptic novel of some kind ever since I read Stephen King's The Stand. And I was very interested in like the human reactions of characters to an event like this, because, it's, when a novel features, zombies, or if it's a virus or whatever, I mean, it's difficult to know how to react. But in this case, it's like nothing about life has changed except all of our technology is gone. And it seems like it wouldn't be that bad until you realize that once there are no more tractor trailers bringing foods into large cities, once the pumps that drive our water supply stop working, once there's no more communication, it would be very difficult to survive for someone who lives in a large city. So I was just fascinated with the idea of that happening and what it would be like for, our very modern and fast-paced society to be just come to a screeching halt, essentially. And then how would individuals react? And, there's a whole group of people out in the world called, preppers or doomsday preppers who have considered this at a very deep level. Many people go out and spend a lot of money and buy supplies and food and have a plan, a bug out plan, as they call it, for what they would do if something like this happened. But I don't, and most people that I know don't. And I really thought it would be interesting to see what those people would do, how they would react. And, there's the idea of survival. It seems sort of automatic to everyone, but, some of the characters in the novel wonder if survival is even what they want out of this, because if their lives have changed completely and every waking minute is spent trying not to die, is that really what they want when they've come to, enjoy what is for most of us a very, easier existence, I guess you would say.
Yes, so that's kind of the 50,000 foot view of the book. And I was interested to see, obviously, we talked about this before, you've been working on this book for a long time, and timing is such an interesting moment when books come out. Of course, that's why we're not having an in-person book signing, but also, I've been reading a lot about the quote unquote preppers and how a lot of them feel justified in the last several months that they there's been a lot of "I told you so" moments for these people, saying, "Hey, I'm not running out of toilet paper. I'm not running out of this because I'm prepared." All these different things. Do you think that the timing of this book and what's happening in the world make it more relevant? Obviously, a pandemic and an EMP are two different things, but mass hysteria and chaos and all these things are the same, no matter what the result is. You do see more post-apocalyptic books being read right now,
Yeah, which seems odd because you think people would want to be as far away from something like this as possible. But I don't know if it is like an escapism or a way to, understand how other people would behave or react. It's been very surreal because, I wrote the novel over the past several years, obviously pre-pandemic. And, there are scenes in the novel where people are at the grocery stores and, everything's flying off the shelves. There are scenes a little bit later in the story where people are, sheltering in place. They're trying to, some of the main characters have managed to get a somewhat supply of food. And so their idea is, let's batten down the hatches. Let's just stay inside, not let anyone outside realize that we have this. And that what they're doing sort of feels like what a lot of us are doing now, which is staying home, staying away from, public gatherings and stores and things like that. And those scenes feel very familiar when you read them now, as if they were written for this, even though that was not the case. So it's a little bit strange to try to promote something that feels close to a reality that some of us are living right now, and not to capitalize on it in any way, but it's just the reality of this book is being published while this is happening. Will it draw readers to the book? It's hard to know that. I've had friends that said, "Oh my gosh, you've got the perfect timing for this." And others are like, "There's no way in the world I would read this right now." So it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is.
I know that you love movies and you have a very kind of cinematic view. And one of the things that you do great in this book is just destroy things and have a great imagination with all the chaos that would ensue should something like this happen. And of course, there are lots of studies and actual scenarios that have been played out, say if this happened, these things would happen, planes would fall from the sky, all these different things. And one of the great things that you can do with a novel, right, that we don't have $80 million to make a movie, right, but you can make as big of a canvas as you want in a novel, right? You can, as big as however big your imagination is. Did you have a good time kind of playing in that? You're kind of playing God in a way, kind of making this world just fall apart. Was that a fun way? And how do you relay action through words,
So yeah, so like, one of the opening scenes are two of the characters, Thomas, who's a screenwriter, and Skylar, who is an actress, and they're working on a project together. He goes to pick her up from the airport, and they're just a few minutes away from leaving when his phone stops working and all of the cars around him stop running, and he happens to own this vintage vehicle. And it's not really a coincidence because he bought the vehicle because he has just written a screenplay about an EMP event. And he scared himself into being prepared, which is how he ends up having some food supplies or whatever. And, they're driving out of the airport and planes start falling and crashing all around them. And, obviously writing a scene like that is, if you want to call it fun, I mean, it's terrible for the characters that are stuck in it, but it is very cinematic. And it's, something that's interesting to try to draw those pictures for readers who have, I'm sure, read other novels where disasters happen, and to try to come up with, intelligent or really descriptive ways and innovative ways to write things like that is a challenge. And so that's like the first step in a disaster novel or anything like this, is to, you've got to set the stage. The disaster happens, and you've laid all that out, and then the next phase is, especially in what I call in this, a quiet apocalypse. I mean, other than the moment when the planes crash and things like that, afterward it's very quiet. There's not a lot of mayhem, and people are just walking around going, well, now what do we do? And that's where it really, to me, got more interesting, because I love writing those action scenes, of course, but the very introspective parts of, like, my gosh, like, do we have enough food? Like, what are we going to do? There's a scene in the novel where a couple of the characters go to a grocery store, and they try to buy some grocery supplies and whatnot, and a lot of people don't have cash on them because that's not very common anymore to carry a lot of cash, and the grocery store manager won't accept anything but actual currency. It's a very it's a scene that, to me, really made it hit home what it would be like, because there's all these people in line, and the checker is running through pages and pages of inventory trying to find prices and stock numbers and for the groceries that are being purchased, and it just takes forever. And there's no action in that scene, but it was very
It's very nerve-wracking, though.
Yeah, exactly.
I was rereading that, and it reminded me of, this thing about how we're running out of change, right? We're running out of coins, like, everywhere in the world.
Right.
Now has no, coin. It's just, I've heard what we're going through now. You said a quiet apocalypse. I've heard this called a boring apocalypse, the pandemic, right?
Right.
And it's probably more similar to reality as what you were writing about, which is, it wouldn't necessarily always be War of the Worlds. It would be kind of like people just kind of milling around going, like, well, what do we do now? And like, it's not gonna go immediately from that to just, mass chaos. There's gonna be a slow trickle of problems.
One thing that I found particularly interesting about this idea is the lack of communication, because no one knows what's going on. And I know there are a lot of people out there now that are pretty familiar with the EMP threat, and the most likely way that it would happen in real life is either something from the sun, a solar flare, something like that, or a nuclear exchange, or something that happens that's man-made. But a supernova is not, I would say, the most common thing. Not everyone knows what it is, but even so, like, without the communication, without, being able to turn on the television or your phone and get an alert saying, hey, we're on top of this, like someone who might be in charge saying, we have a plan, this is what we're going to do, you can expect this, this, and this over the coming days or weeks. There's none of that. It's just dead silence. And in the real world, there are plans, military plans, and things to respond to something of this nature. But in my novel, because it's global, it basically means there is no one in the world, no other countries that are going to come to our rescue. And the scale of the damage is such that no matter what plans the United States military might have, and what devices they have that are hardened against, this type of EMP, it just wouldn't be enough. And once I read about this threat, because I came up with the idea of what I wanted before I even knew what an EMP was. And once I discovered it and I read more in depth about it, it was pretty chilling. And I think that the fear that would, especially for people who are less maybe technologically adept, or people who live outside of cities that may have even less knowledge of something like this. I mean, who knows what they would think had happened? Would they think we'd been attacked by aliens? Is it some sort of religious, event that's happening? The fact that you couldn't really communicate other than with the people that are directly around you, I think is what makes this different than a lot of these other apocalyptic type scenarios.
Yeah, I know we're both fans of Tom Perrotta's work, and there were, I did think about what he did with The Leftovers and some
Right.
other, especially the TV show version. Actually, the TV show is in some ways much more interesting in those later seasons than the book was. But you do kind of picture these things in your mind in a very cinematic way, like I was mentioning. Real quick, I want to say a commercial. I said at the top of the hour, if you don't have a copy of House of the Rising Sun, we have several links here in the chat. You can get a copy. Since we're good pals, I'm just going to say you need to get a copy. I'm not going to do like the soft sell like I usually do. Get yourself a copy or two of House of the Rising Sun. I'm sure we can even arrange some signing at some point because we know people here. So
we definitely could do that.
Yeah, back to our regularly scheduled programming. So I'd like to go back for a minute and talk about how we got here. As I mentioned, we've been pals for a while, and I've seen you put out several books. And Rift and The God Particle were your first two books. I think we met probably around between Rift and The God Particle coming out.
That's right. Yeah.
And so Rift comes out, and that was your first book. You were, I don't know, probably early 30s, young guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, we've talked about this before, but that is such a big moment in any writer's life. Your first book comes out, you sign that contract, all those things kind of came into place, and you'd been dreaming about that for
10 years
forever.
at least. Yeah.
In some ways, and they always say you have your whole life to write your first book and all those different things. And then The God Particle comes out a year or two later, whatever it was. And then there was a gap, right? There was a kind of a gap between God Particle and Thomas World, which we will talk about at length here in a little bit. But it does seem like in the in-between period there, having read all the books, that there was some challenge in there, trying to kind of find what the next thing might be and who's going to put it out. There was that journey happened there, but more to the books themselves, it seems like, to me, it always felt like you kind of stopped being a person who wanted to be another writer as much as kind of finding your own voice in these last three novels specifically. Is that something that I'm just reading into, or was there something that you felt more freedom to kind of pursue your own, interests more?
No, that's pretty insightful, I would say. I mean, when I started writing, novels, I had this idea, I was a pretty big fan of Stephen King, and I read a lot of, airport novels like thrillers and high, fast-paced novels and, commercial stuff. And that's what I thought that I wanted to write, and so I was writing in a way to try to emulate that type of novel, a page turner, a thriller or whatever. And I really enjoyed it. And Rift was an idea that I had one day when I was, at work, and this thing popped into my head, and I went down home and I started, writing it. And my editor at the time, when he acquired the book, he said one of the things that he liked about it was the fact that the main character in Rift, he's going through this thrilling event and he's running for his life. But before he ever gets to that point, he has to make a decision about whether or not he actually wants to live or survive, because he's had these challenges before. And at least to him, my editor, he thought that separated a little bit from some of the other typical, terrible event happens, and now I'm reacting all the way to the end of the novel until I solve, the mystery or whatever it is. So there was a seed of that already, that I was trying to find something a little bit more, in depth, I guess, or go a little bit more under the surface than just that. But when I wrote the second novel, the instructions, the way I understood it in the publishing world was, we need to follow up with something a little bit similar, kind of in the same vein. And so I just sat down, and it was the first time I'd ever written something with a goal in mind, which was, I have a 2-book deal. I've got to write a second book like this. So that's what I'm going to do. And that was the God Particle, and I'm proud of the God Particle. I really enjoyed writing it, and I still remember it fondly. But I was having some internal conflict about what I was doing, what I was writing, and where I think I really wanted to be. And right around the time, not too long after the God Particle was published, I started participating more in social media online. And through MySpace, if you can remember that, I met a group of writers that were participating in an online, it's like a online journal, I guess, for writers, and publication of writing or whatever, called The Nervous Breakdown. And that was where I like to say that I got my virtual MFA, if you will, because I was able to interact with other writers, very talented writers, in a way that I had never done in the past. I mean, I wrote my first 2 novels before I ever even met another author. And so I was doing all of this in a vacuum. I just decided when I was 15 years old that I wanted to write books, and had no idea how to do it, where to start, who I needed to know, and somehow still managed to get a contract with a large publisher to do that. But there was a reckoning of sorts between the God Particle and Thomas World that you very astutely observed. And during that time, I think that my writing skill improved quite a bit, and my ability to look beneath the surface and get into my characters' heads more, and the prose style being a little bit less generic and more my personal style started to emerge in Thomas World, which was still on the surface just a page-turning thriller. But underneath the hood, there was more going on than that, or at least I wanted there to be. And from that point forward is where I really started reading. My reading habits changed. I got into more literary novels, more serious fiction that has influenced the writing of these high concept stories, to where I feel like what I like to write now is a high concept plot with a more of a literary bent toward it, a literary feel for a page-turning novel, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, one of the things I was so happy about and proud of you for doing was, it would have been very easy to go down the road at some point of self-publication. I hear about this all the time, right? Because there are frustrations. We hit walls with projects, and you have some idea and you just want to get it out there. And I meet so many local writers and other people. I mean, just 2 days ago, somebody mailed me like 20 short stories in the mail, all typewritten, asking like if we could help with, so stuff like that happens all the time.
Right.
And we do have this access, and I'm not looking down on anybody that chooses to self-publish a book. A lot of people, that's a great resource, and there's probably more tools to do that than ever. But that's not something you ever wanted to do. And we've had lots of discussions about this. And it's not just for that third-party affirmation or anything like that. I mean, talk about that kind of journey, and when you've kind of had to believe in yourself to say, hey, this is quality work. I'm going to get it out there at some point, and you trust that fact that the stories are good, the work is good, and that you're a great writer, and someone's going to notice that.
Well, along with all of this, personal journey that I was having, and that a lot of authors have, there was, seismic change going on in the publishing industry as well. The consolidation of a lot of smaller houses into what's now the Big Five or Big Six, depending on your point of view. And during that time, the publishers and editors, at least as far as I understand it, they started having a little bit less leeway to build an author's career and accept early losses in exchange for long-term gains and long-term profit. So, the the way, and my agent, he kind of explained this in detail. Well, a lot of the publishers are just publishing a bunch of stuff from first-time authors, seeing what sticks, and then whatever happens to be successful, just chase that rabbit hole and just go down that path. And any ones who didn't stick right off the bat, maybe their ability to be published, again and again is diminished compared to how it might have been earlier in the 20th century, especially, mid-century, late century. There was more, I would say, longer term investment in authors. So I'm battling, and not only me, any new author is battling that along with their own internal desires and demons that they're, fighting. Yeah, and I knew some authors, some of whom I've met through the Nervous Breakdown or some of these online forums, who just decided to go the self-publishing route. They were tired of being rejected. And like you said, all of these tools are available now from, various online publishers. And, they didn't want to hear no that many times. And, my agent tells me, he's always telling me how difficult the market is. And he's like, every time I send him a new novel, he's like, oh my gosh, the marketplace is terrible right now. And I'm like, well, I think it's always been terrible at this point. But if you believe in yourself enough and you stick to it enough and you refuse to accept no, then at that point, you just have to make the decision inside. You're like, I'm going to keep working on this. I'm going to believe in this. And it doesn't happen every time, of course. I mean, any author at any time could have published their last novel and not be able to find something for the next one. But for me, and there are a lot of self-published authors that are making a heck of a lot more money at this than I am. So I've never begrudged someone for that decision.
Right.
But my choice was to go down the more traditional path. And after the first two novels were at a larger publisher, we've gone to an independent publisher to try to get a little bit more, attention from editors and publicists and stuff there. And, the reaction and the difference between a large and a small is obvious when it comes to publicity dollars and things like that. But then again, if you're not, one of the top authors at some of the larger publishers, you're really not getting the lion's share of the marketing money anyway. So, there are other tools now available, social media and all kinds of stuff that online advertising and things that authors can do, which most authors I know, including me, are loath to do. I mean, I hate the publicity side of it, this event notwithstanding.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's something that meant a lot to me, to stick with it and stay on the traditional publication route. And I have to believe that if what you're writing is good enough, that at some point, somewhere, something will happen that will draw an audience to it. And once that happens, all of this work that you've been doing up till then will suddenly look new to a lot of readers that have never heard of you. And if that doesn't happen, I'm writing these for me as much as I'm writing for anyone else to read them. And I enjoy doing it. I would do it even if I weren't being paid for it. So, but it has been quite a journey, both personally and, just in the industry in general.
For those of you just now joining us, we are speaking with author Richard Cox for his new novel, House of the Rising Sun. That's a Terry Gross cut in I just did there. Just see, no, I don't think anybody's dropping in right at this moment, but
just in case.
I'm curious to know if you think you're a better writer now than you've ever been. Do you see progress in your style? Are you able to be that separated from yourself?
Well, I'll say that I don't know any artist that doesn't think that their newest product is not their best one. So, with that being said, yes, I do see a large difference between every book. I mean, as proud as I am of The Boys of Summer, which was my previous book, when I look at it compared to The House of the Rising Sun, I feel like I could go back and rewrite it and make it even better than it is. But yeah, I mean, I try to be as objective as humanly possible with my work. And for anybody out there that might be watching this that wants to be a writer, I would say that is the number one quality to have, is to be objective enough and be willing to listen to criticism enough, either from yourself or from others, to take that criticism and that feedback and apply it to your own work, and be able to look at your writing on a page to page basis, and then pick up a novel of somebody that you really admire and look at it and go, I'm just not there yet, and that's something that I think, and I've known writers that have struggled with that they think that whatever they write is amazing, and they don't want really a lot of feedback from other people. And that's not, I don't think, for me at least, that's not the way to success. It's more of, listening to what your readers have to say, editors, beta readers, things like that. But as I look at my own work, if I want to go back and look at Rift, I mean, I love Rift. I like the concept, but if I were writing it now, it would be a completely different novel.
Yeah. I'm curious, your life's a lot different than it was when those early books came out in many ways. I'm curious, how has being a dad, for example, changed writing in terms of like your schedule, and even when you do it, you can't just be doing what you want to do all the time. How has life impacted kind of just the life of a writer?
Well, it's amazing having a family to start with. So, and I know that a lot of art is created from periods in an artist's life when they're not happy or they're experiencing difficulty. That's happened to me in the past. But when I wrote this novel, I was as happy as any author could be, I would say. And it did change my writing schedule, for instance. Like, I historically, before I had a family, was a person who wrote very late at night into the wee hours of the morning in the dark, with music playing, and kind of this immersive environment. And, when you have young children and you have, a wife and a family, your schedule, you have to be able to adapt to that. And I know a lot of authors have said, well, I can't find time as a dad or a mom to be able to do this. And again, if you want to do it badly enough, you just have to find that time somewhere. So I became a morning person during the course of writing this book, and would get up, as early as 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday and Sunday to, luckily my youngest daughter was sleeping, pretty late back then. And so I could carve out 3, 4, 5 hours in the morning on the weekends, which was absolutely the last time that I would have been writing prior to that point in my life. But it ended up working out great. And, a person who is got writing in their blood is going to figure it out somehow. And being happy and having a family, I don't think had any impact on my ability to write, good fiction. I just had to figure out a different time to write it during the day, but it worked out, and it's been great.
I'd like to talk about Thomas World for a second. Thomas World came out, got to be a decade ago almost. Like we said, that was kind of the book that kicked off what I would call this middle period we're in right now. I think when we look back on your oeuvre, when you're an old man, this will be the middle years, But kind of tell people who may not be familiar with this, because I'm sure not everybody watching has read all the books, but who is Thomas and how does he kind of play into this larger universe, including in the new book?
Yeah, so Thomas, I don't like to write series, where you have a character that keeps running into new challenges over and over, kind of similar type stories. But I do like the idea of characters appearing in different novels and tying those novels together in the same, literary universe. And Thomas's first appearance was Thomas World, and that was the novel where I was having this kind of transformation and trying to get a little bit more in depth from a characterization point of view. And I was also becoming a big fan of Philip K. Dick at the time, and he was a writer of unreality. He kind of brought this idea of what is reality and which reality are we living in to the public consciousness, I would say, back in the 50s and 60s and into the 80s. And so Thomas was a creation of the idea that I had that, maybe our world, it wasn't my idea by any means, but I was fascinated with the idea of what if our world is not what we think it is? What if it's some kind of game or simulation that some people in some extra dimensional or higher level reality are currently playing or observing or whatever. But I wanted to take the reader through the journey of a person who was not indoctrinated or not familiar with that idea. Thomas, basically at the beginning of Thomas World, has no idea about this type of concept of this other reality. And so as he learns it in the novel, any readers who aren't familiar with that concept would follow him along and also learn it. So in that novel, he is a screenwriter who has almost had some success, but he's in a dead-end job, and he's in a relationship that's not working out for him or for his wife. And his break from reality begins early in the novel, and for much of the story, you really aren't sure if he's experiencing a psychotic break, if he's become schizophrenic, what's really happening with him. And then as it progresses, I think there's no real answer at the end of the novel, but for most readers, you would say it turns out he is living in this reality that he himself has created or helped create. And it's still one of my favorite stories, his journey into that, trying to really understand, am I completely crazy, or am I experiencing this reality in a way that most other people don't? So when I got ready to write House of the Rising Sun, and I had this, I needed a way to have a character in the novel who could be somewhat prepared for an EMP, because if you weren't, it'd be a pretty short story. You wouldn't have any supplies, you wouldn't make it very long, and that would be it. And that may be the outcome for a lot of people in that situation, but for a novel, you need some way for some of your characters to make it a little bit farther into the story. So I came up with this idea of the screenwriter who had written this screenplay about this event that caused him to become sort of a half prepper, or sort of a lazy prepper, I guess you would say. He's amusing himself more than he really is being a hardcore prepper. And it seemed really natural to make that person Thomas, because I had this character from a previous story. And so essentially in House of the Rising Sun now, Thomas in House of the Rising Sun, his first screenplay that was sold and made into a very successful film was Thomas World, which is my novel Thomas World. So it ties those two books together in a kind of a basic way, because they're similar titles and similar concepts. But it also allowed me in House of the Rising Sun to explore this idea of, now my Thomas, who is this real character in the House of the Rising Sun, starts to question whether or not the screenplay that he's written is real, or if somehow he's now trapped in the screenplay that he's written. And then it harkens back to these concepts from the novel Thomas World. So they're obviously meant to be kind of interwoven and make the reader, question the reality of the current novel, and then maybe be curious about the previous novel and see the history that led Thomas into this place. So, if a reader really enjoys House of the Rising Sun and they're looking for more, there's no sequel, there's no prequel, but there are other novels out there where he is a character that can kind of flesh him out more and lend more depth to the character.
There's so many interesting characters in the new book. I'm curious, and also especially Boys of Summer, which I really love that book. How many times have people asked you if characters you've written are based on them? Do you have friends and family who think that they're in your books, or that you based a character on them, or the way they talk or what they say?
Yes, of course. And it is true that people from my real life do appear in books, but not in the way that those people think that they do. Because I'm a firm believer that art is not created out of a vacuum. And even if you're an artist that refuses to acknowledge or doesn't want to acknowledge all of the other art and media that has influenced you, your brain just doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it's absorbing information from a multitude of sources, and whether you want it to happen or not, you're being influenced by your everyday experiences, you're being influenced by films and books and music. And so I don't try to pretend as though my characters are not based at least partially on real people, or at least scenes being reminiscent of things that have actually happened to me or people that I know. But the way you turn that into art is you take a kernel of that idea or of that person, and then you flip it in a way, or you modify it in a way that makes it hard to recognize that it's actually that person or that event that happened or that scene or that argument that you have with someone or whatever. But in very small increments, if you were to read a page or two and you were a friend of mine and that had happened to you, you would say, wait a minute, that's us. But then on the very next page, that character is doing something that that person would never do or would never say. And so it's, I try to also, play around with that a little bit. I mean, there are probably 10 or 15 jokes that I'm making to my wife in the novel that no one else would realize are there, but, it's just winks to her or to friends of mine or whatever to amuse myself. And there are actually quite a few Easter eggs in the book that I'm not even going to mention here because it would kind of spoil it for people to find. But there's all kinds of stuff in there that if you're a dedicated reader and you're a fan of the book and you're really paying close attention, and especially if you read it more than one time, you'll be rewarded with things that pop out that maybe weren't obvious on a first read.
When I first had a chance to look at this book, it was in a much different form than this. And how much longer was the piece that I read compared to this? It was a lot longer.
Not quite twice as long, but close to it.
So my question is, when reading that, the bones were there, right? Like the pieces were there at that time. Is that a process where you're going in it with your editor, or had you, by the time this got to the editor, taken it way down to the, was that something that had already been done for the most part by the time you got closer to the actual edit with an editor?
Well, so I think, as any author would say, your first draft, when you go back and rewrite it, you're immediately going to lose 10 or 20% of the novel just from all of the times you repeated yourself, or in your prose, you were just not as concise as you wanted to be. So you always know the work is going to get, most of the time it's going to get shorter after you've written it. But even so, after I went through that process, because I wrote the first draft, I finished it and I celebrated and I was all happy that I finished this extremely long book. I mean, it was more than 200,000 words long, which, for the average person maybe doesn't mean anything, but that's a pretty long novel. It would have been 700 or 800 pages. I pared it down to what I thought was pretty awesome, and I sent it to my agent, Matt Bialer, who, if he's watching, hi, Matt. And he immediately wrote back and said, you got to cut this down by at least 40%. And I thought, well, where in the world am I going to cut up 40% of the novel to get rid of? And then he let one of his assistants read it, and she had the same feedback. And so I knew it was too long, but I wasn't sure exactly why. And there was some feedback about cut this character completely out, just focus on these other characters. And the novel takes place, is told from the perspective of multiple characters, but there's two main threads. There's a thread with a bunch of my protagonists that is told in the third person. And then there's a section of the novel, the other half, I would say, that's told by a character named Aiden, which is told in first person. And, there was some discussion about why don't I just remove his portion completely and just focus on these other characters. But it was really important to me to tell what I considered both sides of this story. So there were my characters who are more, suburban and kind of just your typical people who are just enjoying their normal lives. And then Aiden and some of his friends were coming from a different point of view. They were maybe a little bit less law-abiding, and Aiden's, he himself, maybe he's not totally right in the head. And I just felt like the point of view that he was bringing to the story needed to be told. And so I just went back through it and started identifying scenes and areas that just weren't necessary. And I did a very large rewrite that cut out about a third of the novel, I would say. Sent it back to my agent, and he's like, this is much better. And we went to market with it. And the first round of submissions that we had were, we got some feedback, but there weren't any bites. And then I really decided to look at the novel again with the most absolute critical eye and say, what can I do to pare this thing down, both in language and in scenes? And I don't know why you can't do this the first time that you write something, but I took probably like 6 months off. And when I came back to it, I just saw it with a completely different set of eyes. And not only did the prose become much more direct and much more, kind of precise, I guess, but also I finally found the scenes that were the most important. And also during that rewrite, there were some characters who I realized really hadn't undergone enough of a journey or enough of a transformation during the course of the book. There's one character who the way that she transforms in this final version is so drastically different from her original version. She was my least favorite character in the first draft, and she became either my favorite or one of my most favorite at the end, because I just disliked her as a character. And then her growth at the end inspired me kind of, even though I'm the one who wrote it, I really enjoyed the journey that she took. And that's one of the, beauties of writing fiction or any kind of art, I guess, is you're discovering these elements or these facets of these characters' lives that you didn't realize were there when you started, which is already awesome by itself. But what you're really discovering is those things inside yourself, because you are coming to your own realizations and your own point of view about the world, and the way that you look at the world and the way that you look at your friends or anyone evolves, because you've immersed yourself in these characters' lives so much that you are able to see more people's points of view than you would otherwise be able to, which to me is probably the most rewarding side of it, is my own growth while trying to write something of, like this. So I've enjoyed that, and I'm much happier that the book is, half the length it originally was, because also, it's daunting for your typical reader to pick up a long novel, and that'll scare a lot of readers away from it. So in my mind, when I started, I had this idea of writing this epic novel, and epic to me meant thick, but really the epic part of it is what happens in the novel, and it doesn't have to be 800 pages or 1,000 pages for that to be the case.
It's interesting. It's a bit of a cliche now, but there's that famous quote that says, no work of art is ever finished; it's abandoned, right? Meaning that, you could sit in a room and edit this forever, and if you probably sat down and looked at any book you've written, you'd probably want to make changes at every point, probably.
Of course, yeah.
So to that point, how do you know? Just to put a pin in this final question here, is how do you know when you're done?
That's a tough one, because like you said, I could pull one of my other novels off the shelf and start again. But I guess you get to a point, and it's funny to say, because every time you're in the promotional aspect, you're ready to share the book with the world, and you're ready to talk about it. And it's time to talk about it, I guess is a better way to say it. You're pretty sick of it by then. Like, it's amazing to, have your novel appear in the mail and look through it and go, oh my gosh, it's like an actual book now. But at the same time, I have read those words so many times, and I know them so intimately that I've pretty much had it at this point with them. And I love it. I think it's the best novel that I've written, and I'm so proud of it and excited for what hopefully there'll be some, positive reception around it. But though I guess the way that I know that I'm done with it is I just don't have anything else to say. Yeah. I could, of course, pick it up in 5 years and critique the prose, the writing style. I could say, I can see these characters more in depth than I could then, but I still wouldn't have anything more to say about them than I do now. And so that's the point where I think you feel finished, because you could tinker and tinker and tinker, but the end product would not be much different than what it is.
Just a couple more questions before we wrap up. And before we do that, just a reminder, get your copy of House of the Rising Sun. We have plenty of links here in the chat where you can buy it directly from Magic City Books. Buy local. we'll get you some signed copies. We'll get it all taken care of. So when the EMP happens and all the technology just disappears, I will be honest with you, and I romanticize elements of that sometimes. You know, we get so caught up in the busyness and hectic period of our world. There are moments where you go, man, remember what it was like to not have a phone on you 24/7? Remember what it was like to go somewhere and not have everyone know where you are and not worry about you even, you know, like you ever like leave your phone at home or something and everybody thinks you're dead for like a day?
Right.
It's crazy. You've always been such a kind of techie guy, and you know you're interested in that stuff. Is that something that you ever pine for, or are you always about like, I want the next gadget, I want the next technological thing, or do you ever get kind of like, you know, a little, do you ever pine for the simplicity of the past like that?
I don't pine for that much. My wife and I like to joke around about the good old days, and she, calls herself an old soul and says that she would wish that she'd been born 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or whatever. And there's some aspect of that I totally respect and understand, because the world sometimes seems like it's just chaos and you can't get away. I mean, with your phone device, you're always reachable. But also there's so much value to technology and medical science and all of the things that science and technology have brought to us. While there are complications, I think on balance, most people's lives are easier than they might have been 100 years ago. They're not simpler necessarily. So I did think a lot about that while I was writing this, because one thing that I was really looking for, since this is a piece of not only art, but it's meant, if you pick up a novel, there's some portion of you at least that wants to be somewhat entertained, or at least learn something about yourself or about the world. And the novel, as it was originally written, was pretty dark and didn't end on a very hopeful note. And even a novel that I looked to, not really for its content, but more of its mood, was Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And that's a very dark story. And, but still there are elements of, there's obviously the father's love for the boy, but at the end too, there's just a tiny twinge of maybe this isn't completely going to end in an awful way. I mean, it's left open to some degree, but, I had readers that said, we need to find something to hang on to at the end of this story that makes it worth the journey. And so when I started thinking about it more in depth, I thought about some of the characters in the stories whose reliance on technology, or just their connection with the world, and how it was so based on who were they going to speak to next, and how many phone calls, and what was going on in their lives, and to have it be pared down to something more simple. A couple of the characters actually saw some real value in that, because no matter what technology, no matter what you have going on in your life, in your work, or whatever, at the end of the day, you're not going to remember all the gadgets that you had in your life. When you get to the end of your life, in your twilight years, you're going to think a lot more about the people that you met and the love that you had for your family and your friends. And in a modern world, it's easy for some of those things to become clouded by everything that's happening. And so I think that there's some value or some hope in the book about people getting back to the basics, and being more in touch with their relationships with friends and family. So me personally, I think the world's amazing with all these gadgets, and I definitely don't want them to go anywhere anytime soon. But if they did, there is an element of life that would be simpler and more basic, and I guess elemental to our existence than all of these fun screens and stuff that we're always looking at and trapped by, in a way.
On the other hand, we wouldn't be able to do this thing right now, would we? So it's a great moment.
Yeah.
So my last question is I guess about what's next. I'm curious. We haven't gotten to spend much time together because of obviously the pandemic and anything, but have you been working more? Have you been writing during this time of quarantine and downtime? Have you found inspiration, or have you been kind of paralyzed by the moment like a lot of people are?
It's funny. My wife and daughters were pretty excited about Taylor Swift's unexpected new album that came out over the weekend. And she obviously found time and was inspired by, being alone or not being around a lot of people. I have a novel that I've written after House of the Rising Sun that I completed more than a year ago now. And I really haven't worked on it that much. And part of it's been because of the ramp up to this novel being published, but it's also felt, it's felt very strange, as everyone is familiar with. And so it hasn't made me feel as creative as maybe some other artists might have been. So I have, obviously, I have a day job that I'm very invested in and that I spend a lot of time on. And we are watching we've watched probably every television show, bingeable television show it's possible to watch. And a funny thing is, my wife's parents got me a golf net for Christmas, even before the pandemic. And that has been quite an area of something that I can do and go out and kind of be in my own mind and hit golf shots in the backyard where I could, because the golf courses were closed and stuff there for a while. And I don't want to ignore the one question I see in the chat here. Yes, I have had time to work on my golf game, Jeff, and I'll be beating you the next time we play. So just there's that. But I haven't worked that much on my new novel, but once we're kind of past the launch aspect of House of the Rising Sun, I'll definitely get back to it. I'm pretty excited about it. It has some characters from a previous novel that I won't mention here, but no sequel or anything like that, but more of this kind of world building aspect that we talked about earlier.
That golf question, just to be clear, did not come from this Jeff. That was a different Jeff. Stevie Wonder could beat me at golf, so that's not a big challenge.
Right.
I just want to say, once again, a big congratulations on the book. I hope you guys will all go out and get a copy of House of the Rising Sun, of course, from Magic City Books, and get more than one if you want to read it more than once. So it's a great gift. You can support local authors. You can support local bookstores. We all need your help right now, and we're excited about what the next book is sitting in that drawer. You need to get back to work on it, find some time, start digging down, because we're going to want a new thing pretty soon, because we're all going to be plowing through this. So on behalf of all of our audience and everybody else, happy book launch day. I think that we call them book birthdays. So it's happy book birthday.
Happy book birthday. Yeah, that one was new to me until about a week ago. But yeah, that's the new language, I guess, for it. So, well, thank you for having me. Both you and Pat have been so supportive, and everyone at the store has been. I love, I work very close to the store in a normal time. I'm there almost not every day, but a couple of times a week. I think it's great for the community. And, obviously, Jeff, all the things that you've done for Tulsa and our literary community are just unmatched. So thank you so much for having me, for everything that you've done.
Do you want to give some shout outs? Let's do some, why don't you give some shout outs to some people while we're here? It's like, we do the acknowledgement pages. Do you want to say some thanks to a few people while you're here?
Well, I have to thank my family, my wife and my daughters, for being supportive and giving me the time to be able to write. There's a long acknowledgments to my parents at the beginning of the book. So thanks to them. I have a lot of friends that are supportive and that are always out there willing to talk about books, my work that I've done. Like I said, I mentioned you guys, all my friends at work that have been supportive, all of my Nervous Breakdown friends, if any of them are on here. I mean, they've been so supportive. Greg Oliar published an excerpt from my book a couple of days ago, and John Scalzi, the quite famous science fiction author, is going to let me guest post on his website in a couple of days. So thanks to him. And yeah, it's just, even though you write these things on your own as a novelist, it is definitely not just you that is contributing to the project. So my family and friends are always there for me, and I just, really appreciate that. And, here tonight, even though we're not having an actual physical book launch, my wife and daughters are going to help me celebrate tonight with a party here at our house. So we're really excited about that. And thanks again for doing this, Jeff. I just really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been our pleasure. And so thanks everybody for watching. Go out and get the book. We're trying to stay safe. Wear your mask. Don't spread it, but do spread some enthusiasm about House of the Rising Sun. That's something we do want to spread far and wide. So thank you guys again for watching. Stay safe, and we will see you guys very soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.